Before her death in 2017, Marilyn McCord Adams had a long and impressive career as a philosopher and theologian. And while she had many interests, both philosophical and theological, the problem of evil loomed ever present in her thinking. Her approach to the problem was in many ways refreshing. Her compassion for persons as individuals drove her apparent insistence on dealing directly with what was, in her judgment, the absolute worst features of our world. Now, as somebody for whom the problem of evil plays a large part in eclipsing what I see as plausible paths for my own coming to believe in God, I found there to be plenty to chew on in her work. Now, she wrote 2 books on the topic. The first was in 1999, Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God. Second was her 2006 book, Christ and Horrors, in which she develops further the ideas from the first. Now, I intend this video as an introduction to her views, specifically the notion of axiological defeat that features so heavily. I'll be drawing on those 2 books as well as some of her later papers on the subject. To understand her approach, we've got to see what it was that she was pushing against. So McCord Adams was deeply unsatisfied with the traditional instrumental solutions offered for the logical problem of evil. In her view, they were simply inadequate, and they were sidestepping a key part of the philosophical and theological problem. Her reasoning made use of this distinction between dimensions of divine goodness.
Many analytic theological approaches take a global approach. They take a page from Leibniz and conceive of God's activity in terms of actualizing or making a world. And then they infer that the goodness of God is to be measured in terms of the goodness of the world that God has made. And so they focus on how one could argue that the evils of the amounts and kinds and distributions that we find in this world could be compatible with an excellent world maker. So we find Leibniz arguing that this is the best of all possible worlds, or Alvin Plantinga saying that God has made a very good world, or an L or above world, where L is some high level of excellence. And the trouble with this emphasis is that it deflects one's attention, distracts one's attention to the global, away from the way the evils affect persons. And the real problem of evil, it seems to me, in religion and in human life, is not about, oh, is this a good world or not? But it's about how tough it is on the people. And so what one wants to know is whether God is, not whether God is an excellent world maker. The Bible says God is an excellent world maker, but whether God is good to the people, because for all we know, evils in the amounts and of the kinds and with the distributions we find in this world are compatible with this being the best of all possible worlds, but that doesn't answer our question of whether God cares about the people, whether God is good to the folks, as we say.
So one dimension she understands as general and a bit abstract. So divine goodness as producer of global goods. So God's goodness just entails that he's aiming for the best of all possible, or at least sufficiently good world. However, she insisted on emphasizing another dimension of divine goodness, a more concrete, particular, and person-centered dimension, which involved notions of goodness to, or of love of, individual created persons qua persons. For McCord Adams, this distinction gave rise to 2 separate corresponding problems of evil. Her diagnosis: while the global goods solution may suffice for the global problem of evil by framing God as driven toward or animated by sufficiently valuable worlds, they failed to make much progress at all on the second, particular or person-centered problem of evil, especially since part of the datum is the existence of horrendous evils. And it is this second problem, more than the first, that tugs at the heart of religious life. After all, creating a world that is good enough from the outside perspective does not bode well for God's love if it also contains individual lives that are simply not worth living. She thinks it incompatible with God's love of or goodness to persons that God should create persons, the meaning of whose lives are threatened by evils that remain undefeated. So she goes so far as to suggest that not only are such global approaches not up to the task of dealing with horrendous evils, they arguably make the problem worse. as their inclusion to her suggests that relative to God's global motives, his motives relating to the concrete lived lives of his created persons are ones of, quote, divine indifference or even hostility to the human plight. For McCord Adams, the most challenging version of the problem of evil are those that take seriously the lives of individual persons. In particular, she was moved by what she calls the problem of horrendous evils. So, what are horrendous evils? For McCord Adams, horrendous evils are evils the participation in which, that is, the doing or suffering of which, constitutes prima facie reason to doubt whether the person's life could, given their inclusion in it, be a great good to him or her on the whole. So the key is to imagine the worst of the worst, the most plausibly life-ruinous scenarios, being a victim of extremely cruel acts of violence, sexual or otherwise. Of course, not all participants are victims. A mother who backs out of the garage only to unwittingly crush and kill her toddler has also intimately participated in an event so horrible that it seemingly threatens the very meaning of her life. Consider also the Nazi soldier who, through his own steadfast participation in the death camps, slowly dismantles his own moral sensibilities and meaning-making capacities. Now, as her definition suggests, what makes horrendous evils so bad is their ability to sever or to stunt the meaning-making capacities of the participants, thereby directly posing a prima facie threat to their own conception of their lives as having positive meaning, or as being lives worth living. Now, of course, people are built in different ways, and so what counts as horrendous for one may not necessarily be horrendous for another. It's person-relative in that way. But what's interesting and encouraging about her approach is that, at least at first glance, it appears to take seriously the perspective of all horror participants, victims and perpetrators. She's putting her finger on the fact that much of the high-minded theorizing about the problem of evil lacks substantive contact with the lived reality of what it's like to be a human in a world in which horrendous evils have a Loctite grip. So who or what is responsible for our world containing such evils? Well, interestingly, Marilyn McCord Adams argues that the near-infinite gap between God and created creatures entails the impossibility of placing responsibility for horrendous evils squarely at the feet of us creatures. She notes that if God exists, it is He who creates us with not only a radical vulnerability to horrors, but also a capacity to produce them that far outpaces our ability to experience them, leaving us unable to conceive of how bad they truly are, as well as the ability to produce them for ourselves and others when we are intending something else entirely. Our ignorance is often tied up in our horror participation. Having secured our ignorant and vulnerable natures, God then adds fuel to the fire hazard that is humanity by placing them in a world wherein horrors are a feature of some regularity. In light of the fact that most causally salient features of our own human natures and the environment in which we live are not up to us, it makes very little sense to claim, as classic free will defenses and theodicies typically maintain, that we could even possibly bear all responsibility.
The strategy of classical free will appeals is to shift responsibility for evil off divine shoulders onto human shoulders by appealing to the idea that between what God did, create an evil free world with free creatures in it, and evil, there comes an intervening agent, Adam and Eve, our primordial primate ancestors, who are responsible for the introduction of actual evil into the world. Now, this strategy depends on the assumption that created free agency is robust enough to shoulder that responsibility, to stand in between God and the consequences of God's actions. And I think that this appeal fails for several reasons. The first is what I like to call the size gap. God is very, very big, and we are very, very small. God's personal capacities far outstrip human personal capacities.
McCord Adams was fond of driving this point further with an illustration. A child is left by a parent unattended in a room filled with gas that, unless lit, will not harm the child. The child was warned by the parent not to touch the stove, which is outfitted with bright and attractive knobs, which, if turned, will ignite the entire room. Now, if that child turns the knob, igniting the gas and causing a catastrophic explosion, who's responsible? Well, perhaps the child bears some of that responsibility, but I think most would agree that the parent bears a clear majority. Regardless, for McCord Adams, the point is clear. Quote, whether one believes in Adam's fall or credits creation, God is the one who sets us up in an environment in which we are radically vulnerable to participation in horrors. Primary responsibility for this occurrence must rest with God. So that brings us to the moral issue. A human parent would immediately be recognized as immoral for allowing such an evil. Interestingly, though, for McCord Adams, it was not God's moral perfection that, in conjunction with evils, gave rise to the prima facie tension exploited by defenders of the problem of evil. Not at all. For her part, Adams reasons again from the aforementioned metaphysical size gap that God is simply not a moral agent. Quote, personal though God is, the metaphysical size gap is too big for God to be drawn down into the network of rights and obligations that bind together merely human beings. And because of this, she was not at all concerned to identify a morally justifiable reason for God to allow evil. Such a search for her would have been wrong-headed. But if God is not a moral agent, why worry about the problem of evil at all? Well, the short answer is that viewing God as an unimpeachable moral agent subject to moral obligations is not the only way to generate a prima facie tension between the existence of God and horrendous evils. After all, if we focus on God's stipulated love and goodness, that's enough to raise the problem, albeit in a slightly different form. She elaborates, denying that God is a moral agent does not sweep away, but merely relocates the problems about God and horrors. Even if created persons have no rights against God to be violated, so that God cannot be unjust to them no matter how God treats them, still God's attitudes and policies toward created persons can be described as merciful versus punitive, kind versus cruel, lenient versus demanding, without having any obligations to created persons. God has nevertheless engaged in certain relationship initiatives that have raised expectations that God will be good to persons. Whatever reason God has for making us in a world like this, horrors dig God in deeper. Horror participation constitutes prima facie reason to believe that God hates us, that God is cruel, that God is a deadbeat deity and a treacherous friend. While McCord Adams sees no need to offer a morally justifying reason for God's allowance of horrendous evils, she nevertheless recognizes that there's still a need for an explanatory reason, and so that's her goal. How can it be that a good God who loves us could allow such horrors? Here, armed with the resources of Christian theology, McCord Adams shifts her explanatory project to talk of compensation. While God morally owes us nothing, if he is to be good to us, he must compensate us for the horrors that he has allowed us to experience. In her book, Christ in Horrors, she writes, my contention is that God cannot be good to an individual created person unless God guarantees to him or her a life that is a great good to him or her on the whole, and unless God makes good on any horror participation by that individual, not merely within the context of the cosmos as a whole, but within the framework of that individual horror participant's life. For God to make good on horror participation is for God to overcome it with some great enough good. So what exactly is meant by overcome here, right? The simplest way of thinking about this is in terms of what Roderick Chisholm referred to as a balancing off relationship between good parts, bad parts, and the wholes to which they belong. This relation is purely additive, so you can imagine something with parts of disvalue that are eventually balanced off in number and or degree by other parts of positive value, such that the total value of the set of good and bad parts ends up overall neutral or even quite valuable. For example, you might have a terrible morning, but still enjoy an afternoon and evening filled with meaningful interactions and aesthetic delights, such that the day is still, on the whole, a very good day. Now, on this view, the value of a part remains fixed, no matter its relationship to neighboring parts or the whole more broadly. Yet this merely additive analysis of value may for some ring hollow, superficial. It'll seem out of place in certain applications of great human interest. However, at the beginning of the 20th century, British philosopher G.E. Moore cautioned against such restrictive assumptions. writing, quote, "The value of the whole must not be assumed to be the same as the sum of the value of its parts," unquote. More coined the term organic unities to describe such things, things whose value are simply not identical to the sum of their value parts. Now, while the additive approach considers the strength and number of the individual parts, when we consider value wholes as organic unities, we might also then consider the various ways by which those parts relate to each other, and how this can modify or augment their value. Perhaps the variety, tension, unity, or contrast within a thing brings additional value or disvalue. The most persuasive examples of this can be found in the arena of aesthetics or art. An ugly piece of a painting may paradoxically serve to increase the value of the overall piece when we step back and see the role that it plays in the entire composition. The direction of change or development through an individual piece of music may also affect its value contribution. Imagine two pieces of music that contain identical parts, but they're arranged differently. Plausibly, the piece that starts quiet and grows consistently over time with moments of dissonance and tension, which triumphantly resolve in a crescendo, contains more value than a piece where there's no real discernible pattern. There's no, trend. It's just this kind of random bits of music, pummeled together. Presumably that first piece is more valuable than the second. Might something similar hold true about individual persons' lives? Could an ugly part of a life end up improving that life, not just in virtue of its inclusion, but more importantly in virtue of its relation to the other parts, and or its placement within the whole? Is an appeal to such aesthetic features applicable at all to someone's life? Borrowing from Chisholm, Marilyn McCord Adams presses this idea into service toward a solution to the problem of horrendous evils. Remember that horrendous evils are evils that provide a person with prima facie reason to think that their life is not worth living. What's important to note here is that these are prima facie reasons. Right? That is to say that these reasons are defeasible. They can be overridden. Quote, "My notion is that reason to doubt whether the lives of people who have participated in horrors can be worth living can be outweighed if the evil E can be defeated. The evil E can be defeated if it can be included in some good enough whole to which it bears a relation of organic rather than merely additive unity. E is defeated within the context of an individual's life if the individual's life is a good whole to which E bears the relevant organic unity." So her proposal, which she defends as logically possible, is that the horrendous evils in which a person participates will eventually be aesthetically absorbed, integrated, and reinterpreted in light of the other chapters of that person's life, thus defeating their initial prima facie reason for doubt that it was ever worth living in the first place. That horror gains a good aspect, in a sense. The result being that they no longer regret their horror participation. In fact, if fully absorbed, they may actually come to value it. Now, the idea isn't completely foreign to our experience, right? We can imagine a self-obsessed famous basketball athlete who, while walking at night, is the victim of a hit and run. The pain and loss of function leads to depression. He begrudgingly starts down the long road to recovery. Sensing his depression and loss of purpose, his thoughtful physical therapist/mentor encourages him to join the local wheelchair basketball league. He reluctantly signs up to what results in a deeply humbling experience, as very few of his skills actually transfer over. Forced to learn the basics from a group of patient and kind amateurs, he becomes a less self-absorbed person and becomes able to see the good in other people and to value them as individuals in and of themselves. With this change in perspective and personality, he draws the interest of a teammate. They form a friendship, which turns into a romantic relationship. They eventually marry. At his wedding, he states that he considers himself to be the luckiest man in the world, and he means every word. His being struck by the car was still a bad thing, but given how it connects to the rest of his life, it takes on a good aspect. After all, that's when his life really begins, in humbling tragedy. It unlocks a cascade of circumstances and accompanying valuable shifts in perspective that never would have happened otherwise. Not only has his tragedy been overcome, but the circumstances to which it led utterly defeat the prima facie judgment that he originally had about his life as not worth living. Admittedly, this sounds like a Lifetime movie that your mother and I saw last night, but the point remains, these things are possible. The eventual integration of a tragedy into the context of one's broader life has the power to shift our perspectives and attitudes such that one comes to see such tragedies as having a valuable aspect, which contribute organically to one's life on the whole. McCord Adams writes, quote, "The ability to contribute to the positive meaning of a person's life by overcoming evil with good is in part a function of aesthetic imagination, of the capacity to weave evils into complex goods through subtle irony and reversal. Given the horrendous evils God permits, God must have extraordinary aesthetic imagination to overcome them." So evils can be defeated, but horrors are a particularly potent subclass of evils, and when it comes to them, McCord Adams thinks the bar must be higher for defeat. She writes, quote, "Horrors are so bad that no package of merely created goods will balance them off, much less defeat them. The only currency valuable enough to make good on horrors is God, and the horror participants' overall and eventual beatific intimacy with God. So God must defeat the prima facie ruinous nature of horror participation by weaving it into our relationship with God, broadly construed. Importantly, the individual horror participant must come to recognize these moments as moments of intimacy with God. And when they do so, she believes that such moments will no longer be regretted or wished away, but valued in themselves as having a valuable aspect, even if at that time they did not recognize it. God as Christ experiences the horrors of the cross, and for us humans who also experience horrors, the cross constitutes an opportunity for solidarity with the divine. Such moments would be special, personal, almost privileged points of contact with the divine, to which we come to retroactively consent. What McCord Adams is offering here is, of course, a specifically Christian response to the logical problem of horrendous evils.
The Christian God doesn't ask more of human beings than God asks of God's self. The Christian God becomes a human being and not only is able to know what it's like for us within the infinite capacity of the divine consciousness, but to know what it's like within the finite frame of God's own human consciousness and to what it's like to suffer and prima facie life ruinous evils within the frame of a human life. And that solidarity of God with us is something that helps to weave up our own experiences of the worst evils into our relationship with God, which on the whole and in the end could have a happy ending in the life to come.
So this has been just a brief overview of McCord Adams' answer to the problem of horrendous evils. Many who feel underwhelmed by the traditional greater goods theodicies, of which we are all aware, welcome this approach as a refreshing alternative, and many see her preference for a person-centered approach as taking the individual and their felt suffering far more seriously. Do you share her sentiment? More importantly, do you think that it succeeds in offering a satisfactory answer to the issue of horrendous evils as she defines them? Comment below, but of course not before liking and subscribing. That way you'll be notified when the next video releases, which will be an evaluation of this strategy.